The wind howled through the mountain pass as Daniel Flores pressed his weathered hand against the rough bark of the towering pine. His dark eyes, fierce with determination, locked onto the tear-streaked face of the woman before him. "By winter, you'll carry my son inside you," he promised, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade through silk. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, weighted with a future neither had dared imagine just months before. Helen Price stood trembling, not from the cold that bit at her exposed skin, but from the raw intensity of his declaration. Snow began to fall in earnest now, each flake a promise of the harshest season ahead. Yet in his eyes she saw warmth that could melt glaciers. Her hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly, where already the first stirrings of new life had begun. The mountain man had kept his word, just as he had promised he would that first desperate night when she had stumbled into his world, broken and hollow as a discarded shell. But that moment of fierce promise lay weeks in the future. The story began much differently, on a day when hope seemed as distant as the stars hidden behind storm clouds, and Helen Price believed herself destined to face the wilderness alone. The October morning dawned gray and bitter when Helen Price first laid eyes on the remote cabin that would become her refuge. Her husband's death 3 months prior had left her with nothing but debts and the cruel whispers of townspeople who seemed to take pleasure in her misfortune. The wagon that had brought her this far into the mountains creaked away down the narrow trail, leaving her standing before a structure that looked barely fit for animals, let alone a woman accustomed to the comforts of town life. The cabin squatted against the mountainside like a wounded animal, its logs darkened by years of weather and neglect. Chinking had fallen from between the timbers, leaving gaps that would welcome winter's bite. The roof sagged in places, and one shutter hung at an odd angle, giving the single window a winking, conspiratorial look that made Helen's stomach clench with dread. She had purchased this property sight unseen, using the last of her meager savings after her husband's creditors had claimed everything else. The land agent in town had assured her it was habitable, though his shifty eyes and nervous manner should have warned her that his definition of habitable differed greatly from hers. Now standing in the thin mountain air with her few possessions piled beside her like the remnants of a shipwreck, Helen felt the full weight of her desperation. The door stuck when she tried to open it, swollen with moisture and warped by time. She put her shoulder against it and pushed, stumbling forward when it finally gave way. The interior was worse than she had imagined. Dust motes danced in the weak light that filtered through the grimy window. Spider webs draped the corners like tattered curtains, and the smell of mice and decay filled her nostrils. A rough table dominated the center of the single room, its surface scarred and stained. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, its hearth cold and filled with debris. In one corner stood a bed frame, though the mattress had long since been claimed by creatures she preferred not to think about. The floor was dirt, packed hard but uneven, and she could see daylight through several gaps in the wall where the chinking had completely fallen away. Helen sank onto the single chair, a rickety thing that groaned under her weight despite her slight frame. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a mountain avalanche. Winter was coming, the locals had warned her, and winters in these mountains were not forgiving to the unprepared. She had perhaps 6 weeks to make this hovel livable, to gather enough supplies to last until spring, and to learn skills she had never needed in her sheltered life as a merchant's wife. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her cheeks as she surveyed her new home. She had been so proud, so determined to prove she could survive on her own, rather than accept the charity of relatives who had made it clear she would be a burden. Now that pride seemed like foolish vanity, a luxury she could not afford in the face of the harsh reality before her. As evening approached, Helen managed to clear enough debris from the fireplace to build a small fire. The smoke stung her eyes and made her cough, but the warmth was welcome as the temperature began to drop. She had brought basic supplies, enough food for perhaps a week if she was careful, and a few tools that the merchant had assured her were essential for mountain living. She tried to eat some of the bread and cheese she had packed, but her stomach rebelled against the food. Everything felt surreal, like a nightmare from which she might wake to find herself back in her comfortable home, her husband alive and their future secure. But the cold seeping through the walls, the scratching of small creatures in the roof, and the howl of wind through the trees outside reminded her that this was no dream. That first night, she lay on the bare bed frame, wrapped in her traveling cloak, listening to the symphony of the wilderness. Owls called to each other across the darkness, their voices haunting and wild. Something larger moved through the brush nearby, breaking branches and rustling leaves in a way that made her heart race. She had never been truly alone before, never faced the prospect of surviving entirely on her own resources. Sleep came in fitful snatches, broken by every sound and shadow. When dawn finally crept through the dirty window, Helen felt as though she had aged years in a single night. Her back ached from the hard bed frame, her throat was scratchy from the smoky fire, and her hands were already showing the effects of the rough work she had attempted the day before. But with the morning light came a stubborn determination that surprised her. She was Helen Price, and she had not come this far to surrender to despair. Her husband had always said she was stronger than she knew, and perhaps it was time to prove him right. She would make this cabin livable. She would learn to survive in this wilderness, and she would show everyone, including herself, that she was more than just a helpless widow dependent on others' charity. The next few days passed in a blur of backbreaking work and small victories. Helen attacked the cabin's problems with a methodical determination that surprised her. She swept out years of accumulated debris, scrubbed surfaces until her hands were raw, and began the daunting task of rechinking the gaps between the logs. The work was harder than anything she had ever attempted, but each improvement, however small, filled her with a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced as a merchant's wife. The physical labor exhausted her, but it also served as a distraction from the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm her in quiet moments. During her marriage, she had rarely been alone for more than a few hours at a time. Now the silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the sounds of wind and wildlife that seemed to emphasize her isolation rather than provide comfort. On her fourth day in the mountains, while struggling to repair a section of roof that leaked steadily when it rained, Helen became aware that she was being watched. The sensation crept over her gradually, a prickling awareness that raised the hair on the back of her neck. She paused in her work, hammer suspended in midair, and scanned the tree line that surrounded her small clearing. At first, she saw nothing but the dense forest that pressed close to her cabin on three sides. Pine and aspen trees created deep shadows that could hide any number of threats. But then, just at the edge of her vision, she caught a glimpse of movement. A figure stood motionless among the trees, partially concealed but definitely human in shape and size. Helen's heart began to race. She had heard stories in town about mountain men, wild hermits who lived alone in the wilderness and followed their own laws. Some were said to be harmless, if eccentric, but others were described in terms that made her blood run cold. She had also heard whispers about men who had fled civilization for darker reasons, outlaws and worse, who made their homes in places where law enforcement feared to venture. The figure remained still for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only minutes. Helen found herself frozen in place, uncertain whether to call out, retreat into the cabin, or continue with her work as though she had noticed nothing. Her hand tightened on the hammer handle, though she doubted it would be much use as a weapon if the watcher had ill intentions. Then, as suddenly as she had noticed him, the figure melted back into the forest and disappeared. Helen remained on the roof for several more minutes, scanning the trees for any sign of his return, but saw nothing. When she finally climbed down, her legs were shaking so badly she nearly fell from the ladder. That night, she barricaded the door with a heavy table and kept the fire burning bright. Every sound from outside made her start, and she found herself straining to distinguish between the normal sounds of the forest and anything that might indicate human presence. Sleep was impossible, and she spent the long hours until dawn sitting in the chair with a hammer across her knees, staring at the door and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in coming to this isolated place. Morning brought no sign that her mysterious watcher had approached the cabin during the night, but Helen's sense of security had been shattered. She realized how vulnerable she was, how completely cut off from any help if someone with bad intentions decided to pay her a visit. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and she had no way to summon assistance even if she could identify a threat in time. Despite her fear, Helen forced herself to continue with the necessary work on the cabin. Winter was approaching rapidly, and she could not afford to let paranoia paralyze her efforts to prepare. But she found herself constantly glancing toward the tree line, and she made sure to have a weapon within reach at all times, whether it was the hammer, an axe, or even a heavy piece of firewood. For 3 days, she saw no further sign of the Watcher, and she began to hope that it had been a chance encounter with some harmless traveler who had moved on to other parts of the mountains. She even began to wonder if her frightened imagination had conjured the figure from shadows and her own fears. But on the 7th day after her arrival, as she was gathering firewood from the forest edge, she found unmistakable proof that someone had been observing her activities. A neat stack of split firewood sat beside a large boulder just inside the tree line. Wood that had definitely not been there the day before. The logs were expertly cut and split, far better than her own amateur attempts at woodcutting. Beside the stack was a cloth bundle that contained strips of dried meat in a small bag of what appeared to be ground grain or meal. Helen stared at the offerings for a long time, her mind racing through possible explanations. The most obvious interpretation was that her mysterious watcher was trying to help her, perhaps taking pity on her obvious inexperience and struggle to prepare for winter. But she had heard enough stories about predators who use kindness as a lure to be deeply suspicious of any gifts from unknown sources. On the other hand, she was desperately in need of both firewood and food. Her own attempts at cutting wood had yielded only a small pile of poorly split logs that would never last through a mountain winter, and her food supplies were dwindling faster than she had anticipated, partly because the hard physical work made her hungrier than she had expected, and partly because she had underestimated how much she would need. After much internal debate, Helen decided to take the wood but leave the food untouched. If someone was trying to poison or drug her, they would be more likely to use food than firewood. She loaded the split logs into her arms and carried them back to the cabin, glancing frequently over her shoulder to see if her benefactor would reveal himself. That evening, as she enjoyed the luxury of a properly burning fire built with expertly split wood, Helen found herself thinking about the person who had left the gift. The quality of the woodwork suggested someone with considerable skill and experience in mountain living. The fact that he had observed her long enough to assess her needs indicated patience and careful attention. Most intriguingly, the decision to help her anonymously suggested someone who was either naturally kind-hearted or at least not immediately threatening. The anonymous gifts continued over the following days, always appearing when Helen was inside the cabin or had ventured to the other side of her small clearing. Along with more firewood came other useful items. A bundle of dried herbs that she recognized as having medicinal properties, several rabbit pelts that could be used for warmth, and tools that were far superior to the crude implements she had purchased in town. Each gift was practical and clearly chosen by someone who understood exactly what she would need to survive the approaching winter. Helen found herself looking forward to discovering what new offering might appear, even as she remained cautious about accepting anything edible from her unknown benefactor. The gifts made her feel less alone, evidence that someone was watching over her welfare even if they chose to remain hidden. She began leaving small tokens of appreciation beside the boulder where the gifts appeared. Wildflowers, a piece of embroidered cloth from her former life, once even a small sketch she had made of the mountain vista from her cabin door. The tokens always disappeared along with any remaining food items she had continued to refuse, suggesting that her mysterious helper was indeed monitoring the gift site regularly. This knowledge should have made her more nervous, but instead she found it oddly comforting. If this person meant her harm, surely they would have acted by now rather than continuing to provide helpful gifts. As October progressed toward November, the weather began to turn more serious. The nights grew longer and colder, and frost appeared on the grass most mornings. Helen had made significant progress on winterizing the cabin, using techniques she had learned from a book on frontier living and skills she was developing through trial and error. But she was increasingly aware that her amateur efforts might not be sufficient for true mountain winter conditions. It was during a particularly difficult day, when she was struggling to install a makeshift door to seal off a section of the cabin that was beyond her ability to properly repair, that her mysterious benefactor finally revealed himself. Helen was wrestling with a heavy piece of wood that was too large for her to maneuver alone when a deep voice spoke from directly behind her. "You're going about that wrong. Let me show you." Helen spun around so quickly that she lost her balance and nearly fell. Standing just a few feet away was a man who seemed to have materialized from the forest itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. His clothes were practical and well-worn, the kind of garments chosen for durability rather than appearance. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, dark and intelligent, holding a mixture of caution and something that might have been kindness. I'm sorry I startled you, he said, his voice gentler than his imposing appearance might have suggested. I'm Daniel Flores. I have a place about 2 miles up the ridge. He gestured vaguely toward the higher elevations. I've been keeping an eye on your progress, making sure you were managing all right. Helen found her voice, though it came out higher and shakier than she would have liked. You're the one who's been leaving the gifts. It wasn't really a question, but Daniel nodded anyway. You look like you could use some help, and I figured you might be too proud or too scared to accept it if I offered directly. His gaze moved to the cabin behind her, taking in her repair work with what appeared to be professional assessment. You've done better than I expected, but winter comes hard and fast up here. You've got maybe 3 weeks before the real snow starts, and there's still a lot of work to be done. The practical nature of his concern helped Helen overcome her initial shock at finally meeting her mysterious watcher. I know I'm not doing everything right, she admitted. I've never lived anywhere like this before. But I'm learning, and I'm not giving up. Something in her tone seemed to earn his approval, because Daniel's stern expression softened slightly. Mind if I take a look at what you're trying to do here? I might be able to offer some suggestions. Helen hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside to give him access to her work. She watched as he examined her repair attempts, noting how his experienced hands quickly identified problems she hadn't even recognized. When he began to explain better techniques for sealing gaps and reinforcing weak points, she listened with the intensity of a student whose life might depend on mastering the lesson. You'll want to bank earth around the foundation before the ground freezes, Daniel said, running his hand along the base of the cabin wall. And this section here needs more than chinking. You're going to need to replace at least 3 of these logs before winter sets in properly. The magnitude of the work he was describing made Helen's heart sink. She had been proud of her progress, but clearly it was nowhere near sufficient. I don't know if I can do all of that in 3 weeks, she said quietly. I'm still learning how to use most of these tools properly. Daniel studied her face for a moment, as though weighing some internal decision. I could help you, he said finally. If you're willing to accept help from a stranger, that is. I know these mountains, and I know what it takes to survive a winter up here. You're going to need more than determination to make it through to spring. Helen felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. But years of caution, intensified by her recent experiences with people who had taken advantage of her vulnerability, made her hesitate. Why would you want to help me? What would you expect in return? The question seemed to amuse rather than offend him. Fair enough. I suppose I'd expect you to listen to what I tell you about surviving up here and to work as hard as you're able. Beyond that, I'm not looking for anything from you. I've got supplies enough for 2 people to get through the winter, and I'd rather have a living neighbor come spring than spend the cold months wondering if I should have done more to help. His matter-of-fact tone and practical reasoning made his offer seem less threatening than it might have otherwise. Helen found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw was weathered competence and a straightforward honesty that reminded her of her late husband's business associates, men who said what they meant and meant what they said. All right, she said finally. I accept your help and I'm grateful for it. But I want to be clear that I intend to pull my own weight. I'm not looking for charity or for someone to take care of me. I came up here to prove I could manage on my own. Daniel's smile was the first truly warm expression she had seen from him. I wouldn't have offered to help if I thought you were the kind of woman who needed taking care of. Anyone who's made it this far on her own has more backbone than most folks give her credit for. The partnership that developed between Helen and Daniel over the following weeks was unlike anything Helen had experienced before. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, showing her not just what needed to be done, but why it needed to be done and how to do it efficiently. Under his guidance, Helen learned to split wood properly, to bank earth around the cabin's foundation, and to identify and gather the wild plants that could supplement her food supplies through the winter months. Daniel worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years living close to the land. He seemed to anticipate problems before they arose, and to have solutions for difficulties that would have stopped Helen's progress entirely. But he was careful never to take over completely, instead guiding her hands until she could perform tasks herself, and stepping back to let her practice new skills, even when his own methods would have been faster. The goal isn't just to get you through this winter, he explained one afternoon, as they worked together to replace a section of rotted roofing. It's to make sure you know enough to handle whatever comes up on your own. I won't always be around to help, and you need to be confident in your own abilities. Helen appreciated his approach, though she sometimes found his insistence on her independence frustrating when she was struggling with a particularly difficult task. But she was learning rapidly, and she could feel herself growing stronger and more capable with each passing day. The soft hands that had once been her pride were becoming calloused and rough, but they were also becoming skilled at tasks she had never imagined needing to perform. As they worked together, Helen began to learn more about her enigmatic neighbor. Daniel had been living in the mountains for nearly 5 years, having come west after losing his family to a cholera outbreak back east. He had built his own cabin and learned mountain survival through a combination of advice from other mountain men, trial and error, and what he described as a lot of luck and stubbornness. "I wasn't much better prepared than you are when I first came up here," he admitted one evening as they shared a simple meal by Helen's newly efficient fireplace. "The difference is that I had a whole summer to make mistakes and learn from them before winter hit. You're having to compress that learning into a few weeks, which is why you need someone to guide you past the worst pitfalls." Helen found herself looking forward to these evening conversations as much as she valued Daniel's practical help during the day. He was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once he became comfortable with her company. She learned that he had been a school teacher before tragedy drove him to seek solitude in the wilderness, and his educational background showed in the careful way he explained new concepts and his patience with her questions. But it was Daniel's quiet strength and unshakable competence that impressed Helen most. He approached every challenge with calm confidence, as though there were no problem that couldn't be solved with enough thought and effort. After months of feeling helpless and overwhelmed, Helen found his certainty deeply reassuring. As November progressed and the first serious snows began to dust the higher peaks, Helen realized that her feelings toward Daniel were becoming more complicated than simple gratitude. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the easy grace with which he handled tasks that still challenged her. She looked forward to his arrival each morning and felt oddly bereft when he departed for his own cabin each evening. The realization that she was developing romantic feelings for Daniel both thrilled and terrified her. She had been widowed for only a few months, and part of her felt guilty for being attracted to another man so soon after her husband's death, but a larger part of her was simply grateful to feel something other than grief and fear for the first time since her world had collapsed. Daniel seemed unaware of her growing attraction, treating her with the same respectful friendliness he had shown from the beginning. Helen wondered if he saw her as nothing more than a neighbor in need of assistance, or if his own experiences with loss had made him wary of forming new attachments. She found herself wishing she had the courage to explore the possibility of something deeper between them, but her inexperience with such matters and her uncertain situation made her hesitant to risk their current partnership. The question became more pressing as the cabin neared completion of its winterization. Daniel's help had transformed the structure from a barely habitable hovel into a snug refuge that could withstand the worst mountain weather. But as the work neared its end, Helen realized that Daniel would have less reason to visit daily, and she dreaded the prospect of returning to the isolation she had felt before his appearance. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly productive day of work, Helen finally found the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "What happens when the cabin is finished?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "Will you still come by to check on me, or will I be on my own again?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as though they might hold the answer to her question. "I'll check on you," he said finally. "Mountain winters can be dangerous, and it's good sense for neighbors to look out for each other. But you're right that I won't need to come by every day once the major work is done." Helen felt a stab of disappointment that she tried to hide. "Of course, I understand that you have your own life to live. I'm grateful for everything you've already done to help me." "That's not what I meant," Daniel said, turning to look at her directly. "The truth is, I've come to enjoy our time together more than I expected to. These past weeks have been the most pleasant I've spent since I came to the mountains. But I don't want to presume that you welcome my company for any reason beyond the practical help I can provide." Helen felt her heart begin to race. "You're not presuming anything," she said quietly. "I've come to value your company as much as your help. More, actually. I was dreading the thought of going back to being alone up here." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a warmth that went beyond mere friendliness. In that case, maybe we should talk about what kind of arrangement might work for both of us through the winter months. It makes sense for neighbors to help each other through the hard season, and there's no reason that help has to be limited to emergency situations. The conversation that followed was unlike any Helen had ever had with a man. Daniel spoke frankly about the realities of mountain winter survival, explaining that the isolation and harsh conditions created a different set of social rules than those that govern life in settled communities. Neighbors who might see each other only occasionally during the warmer months often spent significant time together during winter, sharing resources and providing companionship that could mean the difference between sanity and despair during the long, dark months. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Daniel was careful to clarify, but there's no shame in acknowledging that we both benefit from each other's company, and that the winter will be easier for both of us if we don't try to maintain the kind of formal distance that might be expected in town. Helen understood what he was offering, and she was grateful for his tactful approach to a delicate subject. The prospect of spending the winter months in Daniel's company, even if their relationship remained platonic, was infinitely preferable to facing the isolation alone. But she was also aware that such an arrangement would inevitably lead to gossip and speculation if word of it reached the outside world. "What would people say if they knew we were spending so much time together?" she asked. "I know it shouldn't matter, but I've already been the subject of enough gossip to last a lifetime." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. People who've never spent a winter in these mountains have no business judging the choices of those who have. Survival comes first up here, and anyone who's too concerned with appearances to accept the help they need probably won't make it to spring anyway. His practical attitude towards social conventions was both liberating and slightly scandalous to Helen's town-bred sensibilities. But she was learning to value practical wisdom over social niceties, and she found Daniel's straightforward approach refreshing after months of dealing with people who seemed more concerned with maintaining appearances than with offering genuine help. As the first major snowstorm of the season approached, Daniel began spending more time at Helen's cabin, ostensibly to ensure that all their winterization efforts would hold up under real weather conditions. But Helen noticed that he seemed to find more reasons to linger in the evenings, and their conversations grew longer and more personal as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. It was during one of these extended evening visits, as they sat close together for warmth while a blizzard raged outside, that Helen became acutely aware of Daniel as a man rather than simply a helpful neighbor. The firelight played across his strong features, and she found herself studying the way his hands moved as he gestured while talking. When he laughed at something she said, the sound sent a warm shiver through her that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Daniel seemed to become aware of the shift in atmosphere at the same moment. Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Helen saw her own awareness reflected in his gaze. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility, and Helen felt her breath catch in her throat. "Helen," Daniel said quietly, her name sounding different in his deep voice than it ever had before. "I think we need to talk about what's happening between us." Helen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I think so too," she whispered. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, closing some of the distance between them. "I don't want to take advantage of your situation or your gratitude, but I can't pretend that I don't feel something more than neighborly concern when I look at you." The honesty in his voice gave Helen the courage to voice her own feelings. "It's not gratitude," she said softly. "At least, not only gratitude. I've come to care for you in ways I didn't expect to feel again after losing my husband." Daniel reached across the space between them and took her hand in his larger, calloused one. The simple touch sent warmth racing up her arm and made her pulse quicken. "I lost my wife and children to the cholera," he said quietly. "I came up here because I didn't think I'd ever want to care about anyone again. But you've changed that, Helen. You've made me remember what it feels like to want to protect someone, to build something with another person." Helen felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the raw emotion in his voice. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of caring too much and losing everything again. But I'm more scared of pushing you away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "We don't have to decide everything tonight," he said, "but we don't have to pretend there's nothing between us either. Winter is long up here, Helen. We have time to see where this leads us." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, Helen felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She had come to the mountains seeking independence and solitude, but she was discovering that the greatest strength sometimes came from allowing someone else to share the burden of survival. As the evening progressed, Helen and Daniel talked more openly than they ever had before, sharing stories of their past lives and their hopes for the future. Helen learned that Daniel had been married for 8 years before tragedy struck his family, and that he had loved his wife deeply. But he also made it clear that his feelings for Helen were not simply a replacement for what he had lost, but something new and different that had grown from their shared experiences and mutual respect. "You're not like anyone I've ever known," Daniel told her as the fire began to burn low. "You've got a strength that most people never discover in themselves, and you've shown more courage in these past weeks than most men show in a lifetime. I admire you as much as I care for you, Helen, and that's not something I've ever felt before." The weeks that followed brought a deepening intimacy between Helen and Daniel that went far beyond the physical attraction they had acknowledged. As winter settled over the mountains in earnest, they developed routines that brought them together daily while still maintaining the fiction that they were simply neighbors helping each other through the harsh season. Daniel would arrive at Helen's cabin each morning, ostensibly to check on her welfare and assist with daily tasks that were more easily accomplished by two people. But Helen noticed that he always seemed to have projects that required his presence for most of the day, and she began preparing meals for two as a matter of course. Their evening conversations by the fire became a cherished ritual, a time when the harsh realities of mountain survival gave way to discussions of books, dreams, and the growing connection between them. The physical aspect of their relationship developed slowly, with a restraint that spoke to Daniel's respect for Helen's recent widowhood and her inexperience with romantic relationships outside of marriage. Their first kiss came during a particularly fierce blizzard that had trapped Daniel at Helen's cabin overnight. As they sat close together on the rough bench Daniel had built for the cabin, sharing warmth and watching the storm through the single window, Helen had turned to say something and found her face inches from his. The kiss was gentle and tentative, a question rather than a demand. But it ignited something in both of them that had been building for weeks. When they finally broke apart, Helen felt as though she had awakened from a long sleep. The world seemed brighter and more vivid, full of possibilities she had thought were lost to her forever. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," Daniel admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "So have I," Helen whispered back, surprised by her own boldness. From that night forward, their relationship took on a new dimension of intimacy and tenderness. Daniel began staying overnight at Helen's cabin more frequently, initially sleeping on the floor by the fire, but eventually sharing her bed when the cold became too severe for such formalities. Their physical relationship deepened gradually, with a passion that was all the more intense for being unexpected. Helen discovered aspects of herself she had never known existed. Her marriage had been comfortable and affectionate, but it had never awakened the kind of fierce desire she felt for Daniel. With him, she felt truly alive for the first time in her adult life, as though she had finally found the person she was meant to be. Daniel, for his part, seemed to find in Helen a healing for wounds he had thought would never close. The grief and anger that had driven him to seek isolation in the mountains began to fade, replaced by hope and a renewed sense of purpose. He spoke of plans for the spring, improvements they could make to both cabins, ways they could work together to build a more comfortable and secure life in their mountain refuge. As January gave way to February, Helen began to suspect that their winter intimacy had consequences beyond the emotional bond they had formed. Her monthly cycles, which had been irregular since her husband's death due to stress and poor nutrition, had stopped entirely. At first, she attributed this to the physical demands of mountain life and the limited diet of preserved foods that sustained them through the winter months. But as other symptoms began to appear, she could no longer deny the possibility that she was carrying Daniel's child. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She had always wanted children, but her marriage had been childless despite her hopes. The prospect of bearing Daniel's son or daughter thrilled her in ways she could barely comprehend. But she was also acutely aware of the complications such a development would bring to their still fragile relationship and their precarious situation in the mountains. Helen wrestled with when and how to tell Daniel about her suspicions. Part of her wanted to share the news immediately, to see his reaction and gauge his feelings about the prospect of fatherhood. But another part of her was afraid that the news might change everything between them, might make him feel trapped or obligated in ways that could poison the natural development of their relationship. The decision was taken out of her hands one morning in late February when a sudden bout of nausea sent her rushing outside into the bitter cold to be sick in the snow. Daniel found her there, retching and shivering, and immediately assumed she had contracted some illness that could be dangerous in their isolated situation. "We need to get you back inside and warm," he said, wrapping his coat around her shoulders and guiding her back to the cabin. "How long have you been feeling sick? Is it something you ate, or do you think you might have caught something?" Helen allowed him to settle her by the fire and bring her hot tea, but she could see the worry in his eyes and knew she could not let him continue to fear for her health when the truth was so much more significant. Taking a deep breath, she reached for his hand and drew him down to sit beside her on the bench. "Daniel, I don't think I'm sick," she said quietly. "At least not in the way you mean. I think I might be carrying your child." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Daniel went very still, his dark eyes searching her face as though looking for confirmation of what she had just told him. Helen held her breath, waiting for his reaction and trying to prepare herself for any possibility, from joy to rejection. "Are you certain?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it," Helen replied. "All the signs are there, and I know my own body well enough to recognize the changes." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though it might provide guidance for this unexpected development. Helen felt her heart sinking as the silence stretched on, interpreting his lack of immediate response as disappointment or concern about the implications of her news. But when Daniel finally turned back to her, his eyes were bright with an emotion that looked remarkably like wonder. "A child," he said softly, as though testing the words. "Our child." The transformation in Daniel after Helen's announcement was remarkable to witness. The quiet confidence that had always characterized him took on a new intensity, as though he had suddenly discovered a purpose beyond mere survival. He began making plans for modifications to Helen's cabin that would accommodate a growing family, sketching out ideas for additional rooms and improved heating systems that would keep a baby safe through mountain winters. "We'll need to think about expanding before next winter," Daniel said one evening as he showed Helen his rough drawings. "A baby will need more space, and we'll want to be sure we have everything set up properly before the child arrives." Helen was touched by his immediate acceptance of responsibility and his obvious excitement about the prospect of fatherhood, but she was also concerned about the practical implications of their situation. "Daniel, we need to talk about more than just cabin improvements," she said gently. "What about the fact that we're not married? What about what people will say when they find out?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, and Helen recognized the stubborn expression that appeared whenever he was confronted with social conventions that conflicted with his practical nature. "What people say doesn't matter up here," he replied firmly. "What matters is that we take care of each other and the child. If you want to be married, we can find a preacher when the pass is open in spring. But don't think for a minute that a ceremony is what makes a family real." His matter-of-fact attitude toward their unconventional situation was both reassuring and slightly shocking to Helen's more traditional upbringing. But she was learning to appreciate Daniel's ability to focus on what truly mattered rather than getting caught up in social expectations that might not even apply to their unique circumstances. As Helen's pregnancy progressed through the late winter months, she found herself marveling at the changes in her body and her emotions. The nausea that had revealed her condition gradually faded, replaced by a sense of vitality and purpose that made even the harshest days of winter seem manageable. Daniel's attentiveness and obvious pride in her condition made her feel cherished in ways she had never experienced before. The physical intimacy between them took on new dimensions as well. Daniel's touch became even more reverent and gentle, as though he were afraid of harming the precious life growing within her. But there was also a fierce possessiveness in the way he looked at her, a primitive satisfaction that spoke to something deeper than civilized emotion. One evening in early March, as they sat by the fire discussing names for their child, Daniel suddenly grew serious and took Helen's hands in his. "I want you to know something," he said quietly. "This child, our child, is going to be born into a different world than either of us knew growing up. Life up here is hard, but it's also free in ways that people in settled places can't understand. Our son or daughter will grow up strong and self-reliant, able to face whatever challenges life brings. Helen felt a shiver of emotion at the conviction in his voice. Our son, she repeated softly, testing the words. Do you think it will be a boy? Daniel's smile was warm and confident. I hope so. A son who can help us build something lasting up here. Someone to carry on when we're gone. He paused, his expression growing intense. By winter, you'll carry my son inside you, he said with quiet certainty. And he'll be born into a family that chose each other, not because of obligation or convention, but because of love and mutual respect. The words sent a thrill through Helen that had nothing to do with the warmth of the fire. She could see their future stretching ahead of them, challenging but full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The frightened, desperate woman who had arrived at the mountain cabin just months before seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone stronger and more confident than she had ever thought possible. As spring began to show the first tentative signs of its approach, Helen and Daniel made plans for their future together. They would be married as soon as it was practical, not because they felt their relationship needed the validation of ceremony, but because they wanted their child to have the security that legal recognition could provide. Daniel began talking about improvements to his own cabin as well, envisioning a time when they might maintain two homes and choose where to spend their time based on the seasons and their needs. The prospect of becoming parents had also made them both more aware of their isolation and the importance of building connections with other mountain families. Daniel knew of several other couples and families scattered throughout the region, people who had chosen mountain life for various reasons, but who maintained loose networks of mutual support and assistance. It'll be good for the child to know other children, Daniel explained, and good for us to have neighbors we can count on if emergencies arise. Mountain life doesn't have to mean complete isolation, especially when there are children to consider. Helen was intrigued by the idea of becoming part of a larger community, even one as scattered and informal as Daniel described. She had felt so alone during her first weeks in the mountains that the prospect of belonging to a network of families who understood their chosen lifestyle was deeply appealing. But even as they made plans for the future, Helen was aware that their current happiness existed in a kind of bubble, protected by winter's isolation from the judgments and complications of the outside world. Spring would bring not only new possibilities but also new challenges as they navigated the reactions of others to their unconventional relationship and impending parenthood. The first real test of their relationship came in late March when an unexpected early thaw made the mountain passes temporarily passable. Helen was hanging laundry on the line Daniel had strung between two trees when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped with a mixture of excitement and anxiety as she realized that their winter isolation was about to end. The visitors turned out to be two men from the settlement where Helen had purchased her supplies before winter, traders who made regular circuits through the mountain communities to buy furs and sell goods that couldn't be produced locally. Helen recognized one of them as the merchant who had sold her the basic tools and supplies she had brought to the cabin, though he seemed surprised to see her looking so healthy and well-established. Mrs. Price, isn't it? The merchant said as he dismounted from his horse. We heard you'd come up here for the winter, but I have to admit we weren't sure you'd still be here come spring. These mountains can be unforgiving to folks who aren't used to the life. Helen felt a flush of pride at having exceeded his expectations. But she was also acutely aware of Daniel's presence beside her and the obvious implications of his being at her cabin so early in the day. The second trader, a younger man she didn't recognize, was looking back and forth between them with undisguised curiosity. I've managed quite well, thank you, Helen replied with as much dignity as she could muster. My neighbor Daniel Flores has been very helpful in teaching me what I needed to know about mountain living. The merchant's eyebrows rose slightly at the word neighbor, and Helen realized that her attempt at discretion might have been too subtle. Daniel, apparently reading the situation the same way, stepped forward and placed a protective hand on Helen's lower back. Mrs. Price and I are planning to be married as soon as we can arrange for a preacher to come up here, Daniel said calmly. We'd be grateful if you could spread the word that we're looking for someone qualified to perform the ceremony. The announcement had the desired effect of forestalling any inappropriate speculation, but Helen could see the calculating look in the merchant's eyes as he processed this information. News of her relationship with Daniel would spread quickly through the trading networks, and she could only hope that most people would focus on the upcoming marriage rather than speculating about the timeline of their relationship. The traders stayed only long enough to conduct their business and share news from the outside world, but their visit marked the end of Helen and Daniel's winter cocoon. Over the following weeks, as the weather continued to improve and travel became more feasible, they received a steady stream of visitors. Other mountain families eager to reconnect after the isolation of winter, traders and trappers passing through on their way to other destinations, and even a few curious townspeople who had heard rumors about the widow who had survived her first mountain winter. Most of their visitors were friendly and accepting, particularly the other mountain families who understood the realities of their chosen lifestyle. Helen was welcomed warmly by the other women, who shared practical advice about everything from preserving food to treating common ailments with mountain plants. She began to feel part of a community in ways she had never experienced even in town, where social hierarchies and conventional expectations had often made her feel like an outsider. But not all their visitors were so accepting. One particularly unpleasant encounter came when a group of men from Helen's former town arrived ostensibly to check on her welfare, but clearly motivated by curiosity and gossip. Their leader was a man named Timothy Taylor, a local businessman who had made several inappropriate advances toward Helen during her widowhood and had been offended by her rejection. "Helen, we've been worried about you all winter," Timothy said with false concern as he dismounted from his horse. "When we heard you were living up here alone, we thought we should come check on your situation." Helen felt Daniel tense beside her, and she placed a calming hand on his arm even as she struggled to maintain her composure. "As you can see, I'm doing very well," she replied coolly. "I appreciate your concern, but it was unnecessary." Timothy's gaze moved pointedly to Daniel, taking in his possessive stance and the obvious intimacy between them. "I can see you've found companionship," he said with a smirk that made Helen's skin crawl. "Though I have to wonder what your poor husband would think about how quickly you've forgotten him." The insult hung in the air like a physical blow. Helen felt tears of anger and humiliation spring to her eyes, but before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward with a dangerous expression that made Timothy take an involuntary step backward. "I think you'd better leave," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that needed no elaboration. "Mrs. Price doesn't need to justify her choices to you or anyone else." Timothy's face flushed red, but he was clearly intimidated by Daniel's imposing presence. "This isn't over," he muttered as he remounted his horse. "People have a right to know what kind of woman they're dealing with." As the unwelcome visitors rode away, Helen felt the full impact of what their relationship would mean in terms of social consequences. She had known intellectually that there would be gossip and judgment, but experiencing it firsthand was more painful than she had anticipated. Daniel drew her into his arms, holding her close as she struggled not to cry. "Don't let him get to you," he murmured against her hair. "He's just a small man trying to make himself feel important by tearing down someone who had the courage to build a better life." Helen took comfort in Daniel's strength and support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Timothy Taylor's visit was only the beginning of the challenges they would face from the outside world. The confrontation with Timothy Taylor proved to be a turning point in Helen and Daniel's relationship with the outside world. Word of their unconventional arrangement spread quickly through the trading networks and settled communities, generating reactions that ranged from understanding acceptance to moral outrage. Helen found herself the subject of speculation and judgment from people she had never met, her reputation dissected and debated in parlors and general stores throughout the region. But the controversy also had an unexpected positive effect. It brought them closer to the mountain community that understood their situation and supported their choices. Other families who had faced similar challenges rallied around them, offering practical help and emotional support that made Helen feel truly accepted for the first time in her adult life. One particularly meaningful gesture came from an older couple, Michael and Angela, who lived about 10 miles away and had been married for over 30 years. They arrived at Helen's cabin one morning with a wagon full of baby supplies and furniture, items they had saved from their own children's infancy. "We heard you might be needing these," Angela said with a warm smile as she helped unload a beautifully carved cradle. "Michael made this for our first child 40 years ago, and it's been waiting for the right family to use it again." Helen was moved to tears by their generosity and the implicit acceptance it represented. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, running her hands over the smooth wood of the cradle. "You don't need to thank us," Michael replied gruffly. "We all help each other up here. That's how we survive and thrive in a place that can be unforgiving to those who try to go it alone." As Helen's pregnancy progressed into its final months, the support of the mountain community became increasingly important. The women who lived within traveling distance took turns visiting to help with preparations for the birth and to share their knowledge and experience. Helen learned about traditional remedies for pregnancy discomforts, techniques for managing labor without medical assistance, and practical skills for caring for a newborn in challenging conditions. Daniel, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing for fatherhood with the same methodical intensity he brought to all his endeavors. He expanded Helen's cabin to include a proper nursery, complete with carefully crafted furniture and storage for baby supplies. He also began building relationships with other fathers in the community, seeking advice and learning from their experiences. "I never thought I'd have another chance at this," Daniel confided to Helen one evening as they sat together in the nursery, surrounded by the tangible evidence of their approaching parenthood. "After losing my first family, I assumed that part of my life was over. But now, with you and our child, I feel like I'm getting a second chance to build something meaningful." Helen reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers, as she felt the baby move within her. "We're both getting second chances," she said softly. "I never imagined I could be this happy or feel this complete." As summer gave way to early autumn, Helen's pregnancy entered its final phase. The baby was active and healthy, according to the experienced women who served as midwives in the mountain community. Helen felt strong and confident, her body having adapted well to the physical demands of pregnancy combined with mountain living. It was during this time that Daniel made the promise that would define their future together. They were standing on the ridge above Helen's cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, when Daniel suddenly turned to her with an expression of fierce determination. "Helen," he said, taking her hands in his and looking directly into her eyes, "I want you to know something. This child you're carrying, our son, he's going to be born into a family that chose love over convention, strength over comfort, and I promise you, by winter, you'll carry my son inside you with the pride and joy he deserves." The words were both a declaration and a vow, spoken with the kind of intensity that made Helen's heart race. She could see their entire future in Daniel's eyes, the challenges they would face together, and the strength they would find in each other. "I love you, Daniel Flores," she said, her voice strong despite the tears that threatened to fall. "And I'm proud to carry your child, proud to build this life with you." As they stood together on the mountain ridge, Helen felt the baby kick strongly, as though responding to his father's words. The sensation filled her with a deep sense of completion and purpose that she had never experienced before. She was no longer the frightened, desperate widow who had fled to the mountains in search of survival. She was a woman who had found love, strength, and purpose in the most unexpected place, and she was ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The promise Daniel had made that evening became a touchstone for both of them as they prepared for their child's birth and their life together as a family. It represented not just his commitment to her and their unborn child, but also their shared determination to build something lasting and meaningful in their mountain refuge. The first snows of winter arrived earlier than expected that year, dusting the peaks with white, while the valley still held the golden colors of autumn. Helen watched the changing landscape from her cabin window, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she felt the strong movements of the child within. The baby was due any day now, according to the calculations of the mountain women who had been monitoring her pregnancy, and Helen felt a mixture of anticipation and nervous excitement about the approaching birth. Daniel had become increasingly protective as Helen's due date approached, rarely leaving her side for more than a few hours at a time. He had arranged for Angela, the most experienced midwife in their community, to stay at the cabin during the final weeks of Helen's pregnancy, and he had stockpiled enough supplies to last them through any weather emergency that might complicate the birth. "You're going to wear a path in that floor if you keep pacing like that," Helen teased one evening as Daniel made yet another circuit of the cabin, checking and rechecking their preparations. Daniel paused in his pacing to look at her, his expression sheepish but unrepentant. "I just want to be sure we're ready for anything," he said. "I know women have been having babies for thousands of years without all this fuss, but I can't help wanting everything to be perfect for you and our child." Helen felt a surge of love for this man who had transformed her life so completely. The fierce mountain man who had first emerged from the forest to help her had revealed depths of tenderness and devotion that never ceased to amaze her. She knew that their child would be blessed to have such a father, a man who would protect and nurture with equal intensity. The labor began just before dawn on a crisp October morning, announced by a tightening across Helen's belly that she initially mistook for the usual discomforts of late pregnancy. But as the contractions grew stronger and more regular, she knew that the time had finally come to meet their child. Daniel immediately sent word to Angela and the other women who had promised to assist with the birth, then settled in to provide whatever support Helen needed. His calm strength proved to be exactly what she required as the labor progressed through the morning and into the afternoon. He held her hand through the worst contractions, offered water and encouragement when she needed it, and maintained the kind of steady presence that made her feel safe even in the midst of the most intense physical experience of her life. "You're doing beautifully," Angela murmured as she monitored Helen's progress. "This baby is eager to meet his parents, and everything is proceeding exactly as it should." As evening approached and the final phase of labor began, Helen found herself drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The pain was intense, but it was also purposeful, each contraction bringing her closer to holding her child in her arms. Daniel never left her side, his voice a constant source of encouragement, and his presence an anchor that kept her grounded even when the physical demands of birth threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their son was born. The baby's first cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy, announcing his arrival to the world with unmistakable vigor. Helen felt tears of joy and relief stream down her face as Angela placed the tiny, perfect child in her arms. "He's beautiful," Daniel whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he looked down at his son. "Perfect and beautiful, just like his mother." The baby had Daniel's dark hair and strong features, but his eyes, when they briefly opened, seemed to hold Helen's gentle intelligence. He was small but sturdy, with the kind of robust health that promised he would thrive in the mountain environment where he would grow up. As Helen held their son for the first time, she remembered Daniel's fierce promise from that evening on the ridge. By winter, he had said, she would carry his son inside her. Now, as the first snow of the season began to fall outside their cabin, she held that promise fulfilled in her arms. "What shall we name him?" Daniel asked softly, reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. Helen looked down at the child who represented their love and their future, the tangible proof that two broken people could find healing and wholeness together. "Aaron," she said without hesitation. "Aaron Flores. For the strength he'll need to thrive in this beautiful, challenging place we call home." Daniel's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss both Helen and their newborn son. "Aaron Flores," he repeated, testing the name. "Our son, born of love and determination, destined to carry on the legacy we're building together in these mountains." As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing their mountain refuge in pristine white, Helen felt a deep sense of completion and gratitude. She had come to the mountains as a desperate widow, seeking mere survival, but she had found so much more. She had discovered love, strength, purpose, and now the joy of motherhood. The frightened woman who had first stumbled into this cabin seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone confident in her ability to face whatever challenges life might bring. Daniel settled beside her on the bed, wrapping his arms around both Helen and their son as they marveled at the miracle they had created together. Outside, the wind sang through the pines and the snow fell steadily, but inside their cabin, warmth and love created a sanctuary that could withstand any storm. By winter, "You'll carry my son inside you," Daniel had promised with fierce certainty all those months ago. Now, as Helen cradled Aaron in her arms, while snow painted the world white beyond their windows, she understood that his promise had been about far more than pregnancy and birth. It had been about transformation, about the power of love to create new life and new possibilities, even in the harshest circumstances. Their son would grow up knowing that he was born of courage and determination, the child of parents who had chosen each other and chosen love over convention, strength over comfort. He would learn to thrive in the mountains that had become their home, drawing strength from the land and from the unbreakable bond between his parents. As Helen drifted towards sleep with her newborn son in her arms and Daniel's protective presence beside her, she felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The mountain man's promise had been kept in every possible way, and their future stretched ahead of them, filled with infinite possibility.